Welcome to my book list. I'm Lawrence, and this week we're continuing to count down my favorite author for each letter of the alphabet, as well as my favorite book from that author. Last week we did A to M, and this week we're doing N to Z, which is a bit easier because there are fewer authors for some of those letters, so it's a lot easier to go through my short list, but it's also a bit harder because for some of those letters there's really a lot fewer authors. So I really had to pick and choose and sort of stretch my boundaries a little bit. As you remember from last week, I was mostly talking about literary fiction and speculative fiction, but we're going to go a bit into the margins there, especially for X, because there's not a lot of authors who start with X. Thank you, as always, for putting your own recommendations in the comments, because this is not only my book list, it is your book list, and you can add your books to my book list because I'm always looking for new authors to read. But in the meantime, let's get into this N to Z, into some really interesting authors and discussions, as well as some really interesting books that I hope are either new to you or classics that you can reread and really get into. So let's start with N. So N was actually a bit more sparse than I'd thought of. If I'd included some poets, I'd probably go with Alice Notley, whose Descent of Alette. Really great feminist long epic poem. We just recently lost her, so I wanted to include her here, even though I'm mostly talking about fiction. Of course, my big N might be pretty obvious to people, but I also wanted to highlight a Canadian Egyptian author because, I'm always really trying to expand people's knowledge of Canadian authors, and this is Noor Naga, who's created two really wonderful novellas, Washes Praise and If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English, and both of them are these really great delves into psyche. Washes Praise is her sort of debut, and it just follows a character who falls abjectly in love with a married man, as well as her friend who falls in love with religion. And then If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English is again a story of a love affair in Egypt. Both of them are just really transporting you to another world. The prose is really, they almost read like poetry and flow really well. So even though she isn't my top pick, I just really wanted to highlight Noor Naga as one of the few N authors. So if you have more N's, please put them below. But if we're going to talk about the big N, Vladimir Nabokov is one of the greatest stylists of all time, and of that in his second language. I'm not going to highlight his most controversial novel because while stylistically it's very important, but the subject matter is just makes me nauseous, and so it's not something that I really like revisiting. But I do really love revisiting Pale Fire, which is a wonderful experimental work. It's an epic poem, and all of the plot of the novel is in these little notes of a character named Kinboat who is adding his little addendum and creating a whole story around this epic poem created by a dead author, and you just fill in this wonderful story in a really experimental way. And of course, the flow of Nabokov poetry. I'd also highlight Panin, which is this really cozy academic satire of the Russian expatriate community. But if you're going to highlight a single Nabokov work, for me, it's going to be Pale Fire. It just holds up in so many wonderful ways. And if you haven't checked it out, or you've been turned off by Lolita, check out Pale Fire. It is really Nabokov at the height of his powers, and it's just an incredible work. He's, of course, my top for the N's. We have a pretty strong field for the O's. I know a lot of people would probably say George Orwell just because he's very famous and his political allegories have really had a huge impact on the culture, 1984 and Animal Farm. Actually, I'm a fan of his essay Homage to Catalonia, which is about the Spanish Civil War, but he's never really had too much of an impact with me as a writer, more as just sort of a plot-driven, interesting cultural touchstone. I would say if you're going through O's, a really highlight would be Flannery O'Connor, who's one of the great Southern Gothic fiction writers and just has this really wonderful way of bringing up these marginalized figures from the South, really steeped in religion and poverty and marginalization and this sort of forgotten time. Really lovely author, and I think really one of the top O's if you're going to talk about it. I'd also like to highlight a Canadian, Michael Ondaatje, which a lot of people might know from The English Patient, but I have to read The Skin of a Lion, which a lot of people have highlighted as one of his best works. But of course, got a shill for the Canadian, so Michael Ondaatje is here. But for a single author who starts with O, you might not have heard of her. Her name is Yoko Ogawa, and she's one of the most diversified writers that I can think of. I recently read last year Mina's Matchbox, which is a young adult novel. A lot of people might know her from The Memory Police, which is a very surreal examination of police that come and take away memories from people. But it is her novella collection, The Diving Pool, which is 4 interconnected, really dark novellas that I first fell in love with her as a writer. She just has such a strong imagination, and these stories almost remind me of Shirley Jackson in their disturbingness, and everything's just eerie and off, but not enough to really frighten you, just to really unsettle you. And then she creates really lovely young adult, like Media's Matchbox, or really wonderful literary fiction. So I just think, as the powers of a writer, I've liked everything of her books that I've read. So she was going to be my strong O candidate, and hopefully you can check her out if you haven't picked her up. For P, of course, we have two heavyweights duking it out for the top spot, but I did want to give a mention to Terry Pratchett, who I have very fond memories of reading during my childhood. He did a book with Neil Gaiman, who I mentioned the problems with him in my A to M video, but Good Omens just has a lot of fun memories to me, as well as all of Terry Pratchett's other books. So he's not my top, but I think you should just highlight him as just a really wonderful presence within the literature community. And from all I've read, he was just an astonishingly good person. And yeah, check out Terry Pratchett. But if we're going to talk about the two P's, it's going to be between Pynchon and Proust. And Pynchon, I've really, really liked his works that I've read, V, as well as Mason and Dixon, a bit less so, but just as a stylist, as that really quintessential postmodern American stylist, I really, really like him. V, I found a lot more interesting because it is really dealing with the American war machine and a bit more modern. Mason and Dixon, which is about Lewis and Clark and all of their expedition, is written in this really wonderful old style and is full of Americanisms. But as a Canadian, I didn't relate to it as much, but a lot of people consider that his best. But I really am hoping to pick up Violin before the new Paul Thomas Anderson movie comes out. So Pynchon is up there, but he really, for me, cannot beat out Proust. And yes, I'm one of those annoying people who has read all of In Search of Lost Time. I actually read it in the original French. I had a really boring internship where I didn't have a lot to do, and so I actually managed to get through that whole series of novels throughout that summer, and it really is a classic for a reason. You have these sentences that just flow on for an entire page. The way that Proust treats time and the flow of it with going back is just really beautiful, and it's honestly just a really great showing of all of the changes in French society, all of the manners that you needed, as well as a bit of the exploration of the underground gay and S&M community in France. But I think if you're just looking at a whole of, nothing really beats Proust because it flows so wonderfully. It is so idiosyncratic and so necessarily Proust that it just fits with the top of the P's as no other author can do, because it is a single gigantic wonderful work of fiction that you can lose yourself in, just like the narrator does. And I just think it's inseparable from the author, and everyone should at least try to read it because it is absolutely wonderful. I have heard that the English translation can be a bit iffy in the later novels, but if you have the chance, pick it up. If you can read it in French, please do, because it flows wonderfully. Of course, for Q was a very short list because I do not have many writers that start with Q, and actually ended up choosing an author that I've only read one book of, but I did really enjoy it, and it is Chang Zhongshu, and a classic of Chinese literature called Fortress Besieged, which is actually a really great send up of Chinese culture. It basically follows a handsome man who bumbles his way through success and then tragedy, and is just a really classic feeling novel that I enjoyed greatly. Again, the list is not long, but hopefully, if you haven't read any Chan Zhongshu, please pick him up. And if you have any cues that you really want to recommend and put in the list, please add them in the comments, because, hey, I have found that I need to expand my knowledge of Q authors through this list. So please add that below. But yeah, one author there, but let's move on to the R's, which actually has a really strong list. R was among the hardest letters that I did, mostly because there's so many strong ones, but none that was a super clear favorite. So in the end, it feels a little arbitrary to pick just one, but you have candidates like Jean Rhys. If you haven't read Wide Sargasso Sea, it is a retelling of Jane Eyre from the perspective of the wife who was imprisoned, and is just beautiful sentences, beautiful prose, and one of those classics. But I haven't read enough Rhys to really put her at the top, but I have a feeling if I read even more of her, I would. And my wife actually has a collected Jean Rhys, which I should really get to, having gone through this list. We also have the Queen of American Letters, and that is Marilynne Robinson. I mentioned Gilead as a very deserving top 10 novels of the 21st century. It's a wonderful tale that's told in epistolary form of a priest reflecting on life, and actually encouraged me to pick up Housekeeping this year, which is, I think, her really breakout debut novel, and again just shows the strength of her writing and really showing a girl growing up in a community and some of the darkness that it lurks there. I really enjoy her work, and of course, there's very heavy religious themes in them, which I think really wonderful that you can get in some classical literature. As someone who's not particularly religious, it's very interesting to explore those themes in a really well written book. Speaking of Robinsons, there's a Canadian author that I want to highlight, Eden Robinson, who's an Indigenous Canadian from the West Coast. And I recently finished her short story collection, Traplines. And I mentioned Shirley Jackson as my favorite J, and Robinson gives a lot of Shirley Jackson vibes. There's a lot of that eeriness, that darkness that's never quite horror, but really flits along with that sense of dread and unease. I really enjoyed that collection. Contact Sports is this almost novella length short story in that, and one of the best I've ever read. So if you haven't heard of Eden Robinson, check her out. I know I'll be checking out more of her work. Just based on that wonderful short story collection. For a very modern author, there's of course Sally Rooney, whose books I always really enjoy. I think probably Normal People is my favorite. Her debut just really captures these two people that you don't particularly like, but you want to succeed because they're so well realized. And Intermezzo, her most recent novel, is a bit long and really just throws you in the minds of these characters. I find Rooney can overwrite a little bit and put you far too inside people, and she should take a step back. But I've always really enjoyed her work, and I think she should be in a short list if you're going to talk about our authors. Of course, there is Salman Rushdie, whose work I've always really enjoyed, particularly at the beginning of his career. I have said before, I think he hasn't really written anything much that I've liked since Shalimar the Clown, but in my Comfort Reads video, Haroon and the Sea of Stories up there, I also really enjoyed, of course, Satanic Verses and Midnight's Children, but he kind of has been circling the same themes for a while. Though he's a really talented stylist, his latest books haven't really done a whole lot for me. If we are talking about Indian authors, let's talk about one who has not lived in the UK for several decades, one who is still very much implicated in Indian politics today, and that is Arundhati Roy. She's only written two fiction novels, God of Small Things, which I think is pretty good, but I think a bit too indebted to Rushdie. But her most recent one, which is Ministry of Utmost Happiness, made an appearance in one of my top 10 lists of the year, and I just think she's a fantastic writer. I really love her, and she's a really prescient essayist. I've read a bunch of her essay collections, and she's just a very admirable person, and I think you should pick up both her fiction and her nonfiction if you want to know more about India, because she's so engaged and so passionate about the communities there, and Roy should always be mentioned. Of course, as I mentioned, the top of this list, particularly for ours, feels a bit arbitrary, and my Canadian bias is showing through, but I will say Mordecai Richler is an absolute touchstone for me. I read The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz when I was in high school, and I've read almost all of his novels, all of which I've really enjoyed. His Jewish Montreal identity really shines through, and he's just a really Canadian classic writer that I think a lot of people grew up with, and he's just so full of Canadian identity that I just really, really love him. If I have to choose a certain book of his, it would probably be Barney's Version, because it's as much of himself in it as he could throw. Like one of the main characters, he also met his future wife on his wedding night, and it took them a while to extricate themselves, but they eventually found their true love together, even though they met on a different wedding. And just, it's a really wonderful portrait of humanity, and all of his characters are so warm and wonderful and full of life. So if you are not Canadian and you're not as familiar with Mordecai Richler, check him out. Oh man, S was also really, really hard. There's some great writers here. I would say I am focusing on fiction, not plays. So, of course, Shakespeare, I think everyone would put at the top of the S's, but I'm focusing more on novels, novellas, and short stories. But I would put George Saunders up here, mostly a short story writer, but I also really loved his really experimental book, Lincoln in the Bardo, which is just so full of Americana, of Lincoln in this sort of limbo afterlife, haunted by ghosts and a lot of conversations, and is just a really wonderful experimental book. And all of his short stories, they can be a bit one note, but he's great. He's solid. I think he should be in a short list. Another perennial candidate for me would be Zadie Smith, though that's mostly on the strength of her first novel, White Teeth, which I just find so full of life and energy and descriptions of modern immigrant-centric Britain. I found that her later novels don't really have that same experiment and force. And Andrea Longchu wrote an essay in her usual very caustic form about how Sadie Smith lost her teeth. But I agree that I haven't really liked her novels after White Teeth, but White Teeth is so strong that Smith has to be up there, and she has been so involved in letters and reviews that I just think you need to talk about her if you're talking about the S's. Some lesser known S authors for me would be Samantha Schweblin, who is a really interesting, I think, Argentinian novelist, but her short story collection, Birds in the Mouth or Pájaros en la Boca, was a really great examination for me. I really loved that. As well for sci-fi, again, a problematic guy, but Dan Simmon and Hyperion Cantos is just one of the best science fiction novels of all time. It's just really this wonderful journey that follows all these stories that come together at a mysterious place where there's an alien called the Shrike that impales seekers and pilgrims. Just a really fantastic thing. But Simon has sort of gone off the right wing deep end and is just seems to be a really hate filled person, but he created this really wonderful book, which I think he made before he went completely off the rails. So it is just one of those books that I really love, but Simon himself just seems awful, so he's not going to quite make the list. And I know a lot of people would have John Steinbeck at the top of the list. I think just based on The Grapes of Wrath, which is a seminal work about the Depression era in America and is just full of wonderful characters and is just being a classic of Americana. I'm less a fan of his other work. I think a lot of people really like East of Eden, but for me, the biblical allegory in that novel is just so heavy handed and so thick that I really couldn't enjoy it as a novel because all I could see was just allegory flashing in neon signs. So just wasn't for me. The Pearl is pretty decent, but not that wonderful. So I found Grace of Wrath really just is a touchstone, but his other work doesn't really hold him up as my favorite author. For that, I'd actually go with a bit of a classical dark horse, and that is J.D. Salinger. I just think The Catcher in the Rye is one of the greatest summaries of that lost youth in the mid-century America, as well as a portrait of someone damaged by abuse and trying to save themselves and the ones they love in a world that has hurt them so badly. It is one of the most stunning character portraits, I think, of all time. As well, some of his other novels, Franny and Zoe, is a really lovely novel as well. So I just think Salinger is one of those great American writers, and I think a lot of people, because they're forced to read The Catcher in the Rye when they're in high school and don't really have the tools to analyze it as a narrator that is damaged, that is hard to love, but is trying his best, they sort of bounce off of it. But I really do not get the hate that The Catcher in the Rye gets. It's an earnest, powerful, and wonderful novel about a damaged person. And on the strength of that alone, as well as the strength of his other works, including his short stories and his other novels, he should be at the top of the list. Yes, for me, particularly even over Steinbeck. Now for T was really fun just because I think there's such a wide variety of writers here. For Canadians, of course, there's Miriam Taves, who grew up in Prairie, Canada, in the Mennonite communities and has these really great novels evoking the Mennonites. For Americans, they might be more familiar with the Amish, but it's similar sects that refuse to use technologies and have problematic treatment of women, with Taves really treats. And she's a really prolific novelist and a really good one, so I would shout out her here if you want to get into some Canlit. For Nobel Prize winners, we have Olga Tokarczuk, who I really enjoyed Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. Flights was a bit too lengthy and scattered for me, but if you haven't picked her up and you aren't that familiar with international literature, she's always a worthwhile pickup, and I have really enjoyed her works that I read, but not as much. They've been more of a 4-star read than a 5-star read for me. For the fantasy people, I know you want me to mention J.R.R. Tolkien, and he is essentially the inventor of a lot of fantasy tropes and a lot of that wonderful fiction, and I know a lot of people love him, especially my sister, who has several J.R.R. Tolkien tattoos. For me, I'm just not as much of a fantasy person, so while I enjoyed his books that I read, The Hobbit was one of the first really difficult novels I read in elementary school, but he just doesn't have that place in my heart that I think he does for a lot of really big fantasy fans, but he needs a shout out just because he essentially is a genre in and of himself. I also want to shout out African writers when I can. I know I haven't read a whole lot of them, but Amos Tutuola is one of those really great writers. He basically creates stories that are full of a lot of folklore, and they flow really, really quickly. They're really fun and rapid. But The Palm Wine Drinker, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts are these really entertaining, rapid fire, really great stories that will immerse you in whole like centuries, it feels, of stories and magic and myths and fun, and a bit of darkness. So if you haven't read him and haven't even heard of him, really pick him up. He deserves to be among the top tier of the tea. I will say before we get to my number one pick that Donna Tartt is not going to be in my shortlist. I've read The Secret History as well as The Goldfinch, neither of which I particularly liked. I just think she is far too long of a writer. Both of her books are too loose. They don't go here particularly well. The Goldfinch just feels like mediocre or even less than mediocre Charles Dickens, and I put Dickens at my top for D, but Goldfinch does not feel that for me. And then The Secret History, I know a lot of people and a lot of newer readers really like it as that sort of dark academia, but it's just way too meandering and long to really cohere to me. If it was maybe half as short and a lot more punchy, I probably would like it more, but I just find her to be too loose of an author, and it does never really penetrate it for much for me, though I know she's for a lot of people. Absolutely not for me. Now, you may have seen this one coming if you've seen my little YouTube short comparing two Russian novelists, one of which I vastly prefer. That's Leo Tolstoy. I just find everything that he does to be so all encompassing. He's a really wonderful observer of Russian politics and Russian life. I just find he constructs these whole worlds. Like he will have a whole digression essay on farming practices and war and peace, and you're just really interested in it because the whole novel itself is commenting on Russian society. Even Anna Karenina, which is not as my favorite as War and Peace is just a really wonderful portrait of all of the class and struggles of the Russian bourgeoisie, even if I don't find it as a psychological portrait of Karenina to be as convincing. That's why I would choose War and Peace as just a really wonderful overall huge shift of incorporating an entire society. But even his smaller works, like The Death of Ivan Ilyich, is one of those great observations of a wasted life, as well as a parallel to Tolstoy's own religious conversion. So if you have been intimidated by Tolstoy, it's worth picking him up, even in his shorter versions of Ivan Ilyich. But if you can pick up War and Peace, just take your time through it, and you'll get a whole portrait of society from a really keen observer, and Tolstoy is, of course, my number one. All right, time to get into some really short letters. We are into you, and for me, there's really only one you author, and that is John Updike. He is a giant in American letters. He wrote so many short stories, he wrote so many novels, he wrote so many essays, and for me, I haven't read all of them, but I did read the Rabbit Run series, which is a portrait of one of those really just almost archetypal portraits at this point of a middle-aged man goes through a midlife crisis. He feels like he's wasted his life, and so he abandons his family and just tries to reestablish himself. But it is a really funny portrait of just a really dumb person, Rabbit Angstrom. But I really enjoyed those novels for what they are, even though they probably don't excite me too much because so much of what Updike has done has been done over and over and over again. So it doesn't really work as much. I'm looking at you, Franzen, corrections. But I think you just have to talk about him for you. But I didn't really have much for you, so if you have other you authors, please put them down in the comments. And the same for V. V, for me, Kurt Vonnegut, just one of the greatest humanist writers, a lot of humor, a lot of energy. People qualify him as a science fiction writer, but I think he's just more of a humanist. He really wants to believe the best in people, and he just has these really lovely portraits of all these small characters in his books, a lot of humor, a lot of forgiveness, a lot of life. So I actually wouldn't choose, say, Slaughterhouse-Five or Cat's Cradle. For me, God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater is just a really lovely novel full of wonder. It's about a man who is a millionaire, and he tries to give away his money, and a family tries to get him committed to an insane asylum, because who would actually do that? And so it's a really wonderful satire about the key of generosity and humanity to people. And check it out. Check out Vonnegut. He's just a really lovely person and a really lovely writer. Apologies if the camera has jumped a bit. My cat, Bo, keeps trying to jump and look out the window. She's made a few appearances in my other videos, and I think she wants to be a bit of a movie star. But we'll keep going through actually a really interesting letter, which is the W's. So you've got fantastic authors. You've got H.G. Wells, who is, I think, one of the precursors of all the science fiction community, but I actually really dislike him as a stylist. I just find his work just doesn't flow well at all for me. I just don't like his writing, so he's not in the shortlist for me. But you do have Virginia Woolf, one of the great modernists who just has these really lovely flowing sentences, and I think a really wonderful touchstone, whether it's like Orlando or To the Lighthouse. Mrs. Dalloway, a bit less for me, but To the Lighthouse is just a really wonderful work, so she should obviously be up here. For sci-fi authors that I really do enjoy, I would say John Wyndham is one of the great pulp sci-fi novelists. You've got The Day of the Triffids, where plants come to life. You've got The Chrysalids, just really entertaining, pulpy sci-fi novels. Just he's not even a guilty pleasure. You shouldn't have guilty pleasures in the things you enjoy. He's a wonderful pleasure to read, and I would put him in my W list. And for Canadian sci-fi, you have Robert Charles Wilson, whose Spin saga I think is criminally underrated. It won the Hugo maybe a couple times. There's a 3-set series about a Earth that gets trapped in a time vortex. Really incredible work there, and I just want to give him a shout out because he's wonderful. You also have Oscar Wilde, I think a perennial candidate, but for me, he's much more of a playwright than he is of a novelist, and Portrait of Dorian Gray is solid and has, I think, a lot of precursors, but didn't really vibe with me too much. It feels a bit too from another age. I also know a lot of people would slot in Colson Whitehead. He is one of those very venerated modern authors, but as I said in my video on the top reads of the 21st century, he has never done anything for me as a writer. I just find him very cold. I found the Underground Railroad to be disappointing in execution and in concept because he doesn't really do anything with an actual physical Underground Railroad. His zombie story is just dead on arrival, and that is not a pun intended. So just never has been for me, but a lot of people respect him. He's not on my short list. But for me, there can only be one, and it is one of my favorite novels, if not my favorite novel of all time, Robert Penn Warren and All the King's Men. Penn Warren is the only person to win the Pulitzer for both poetry and prose. He's primarily a poet, and that is why this novel, I think, has one of the most incredible opening pages I have ever read. This wonderful sentence about being hypnotized as you're driving down the black tarmac in the South, and it's a wonderful, really hypnotizing story about human sin and corruption through the story of a fictionalized version of a Southern populist of Huey Long, but of course very heavily fictionalized, and a story of love and compassion and forgiveness and revenge. It's just a full American portrait. Of course, it does take place in the South. There is racism, and so some people might find that problematic, but for me, it is just a full-throated endorsement of humanity with all its warts and all. It has some of the most beautiful quotable language you will ever read. There's a description of the main woman in this novel, which is Lois looked edible, a mystic combination of Georgia peach and filet mignon, aching for the tongue and ready to bleed gold. Just this beautiful, evocative imagery. I read this right before I entered university, and it has just stuck with me. I've reread it, I think, more times than any other novel. It's a bit long, but it is a wonderful, just dirty, filthy, beautiful novel. And yeah, Warren would be my top for the W's. And now we are into X, Y, and Z. And let me tell you, I did really struggle with these, and so there's a bit of a cheat for X because there's really only one writer or figure whose last name that I know starts with X that I've read, and that is, honestly, it's a book by another guy, but it is his words. It's the autobiography of Malcolm X by Alex Haley, and it is a really wonderful piece, even though Haley did respect Malcolm's wishes and not really include a lot of his break with the Nation of Islam. So I would just say maybe Malcolm X's writings in general, he's a really interesting historical figure who really advocated for the Black community and different means of getting that revolution. So I think, yeah, read some Malcolm X. If you have any other X's, put them in there. But yeah, for X, Malcolm X. I also struggled with Y, mostly just because there's not that many authors, and those that I have are some that other people might like, but I really do not. The first, many people might say Hanya Yanagihara, who wrote A Little Life, which a lot of people love. To me, that's one of the novels that I dislike the most that I have ever read. To me, it is torture porn. It is just exaggerated violence against people for entertainment, for catharsis, without any real purpose other than these dolls that Yanagihara just creates this huge scenario which makes no sense and just makes everything miserable. It is just antithetical to what I want to read out of anything. I know a lot of people found a lot of pathos in it, but to me, it just felt so fake and just is one of those books that I just do not like. I should do a whole video on it, but that book I just very much disagree with its whole premise. Other people might say Rebecca Yarros, who's The Fourth Wing, absolutely blew up in the whole TikTok book community and romantasy genre. I actually have read it. I found it entertaining enough for what it is, but it does absolutely nothing new. It feels very generic, and is not going to be in anyone's shortlist, but I recognize it as fun romantasy for those who are really into the genre. But after those two, there's not a really a whole lot left. So I'm actually going to go with an author that I've only read one book of, and I did enjoy it, but it's probably one that a lot of people will not enjoy. It's a horror author, B.R. Yeager, and the title of the book is Burn You the Fuck Alive. And it is very experimental, very off putting horror fiction, short stories, but I'm into weird experimental fiction and horror, and I really enjoyed it. I have to read more of their work. I'm not even sure if what the gender of the author is, but if I have to put anyone for the Ys, it's not going to be Yanagihara, it's not going to be Yaros. So congratulations, B.R. Yeager. You are my favorite writer out of all of these with Y. Thank you for your last name because it allowed me to put you in this list. And finally, after one last cat-related camera mishap, we're into Zed. And I think for most people, if they had to name off the top of the head, there would probably be three, which are Stefan Zweig, Emile Zola, and Roger Zelazny as the big trifecta. I would say for me, Zelazny, while he might be important, I mostly just know him from the top of science fiction short story collections, and he hasn't really resonated with me as a writer. I doubt I've read much of his work, so unfortunately for that instance, he's going to be removed from the list. I will say that Stefan Zweig is having a bit of a cultural moment, particularly on TikTok. A lot of people have been recommending his novella, A Chess Story, as well as Post Office Girl. I have read A Chess Story, and I did enjoy it as one of those interesting psychological portraits, but again, unfortunately, I haven't read enough of his work to really have him as my top one, so it's almost by default that Emile Zola becomes my number one for Zed. He is, to my understanding, a bit like the French Dickens. He was very socially engaged and interested in the transformation of society by the Industrial Revolution, as well as the immiseration of the working class by that. He has a lot less humor than Dickens, but I have enjoyed his works, and I think he's a very important novelist that more people should read. If I had to choose a single one of his works, it might be Germinal, which I actually read in high school in my French class, so props to my French class for instilling a really great Zed writer for that. But that is it for all of the list of A to Z, 26 authors, 26 books in my top, as well as dozens and dozens, if not over 100 other authors and books and recommendations through there. So hopefully you've enjoyed this journey with me. Hopefully this has allowed you to expand your book list and maybe inspired you to create your own list that you can please, again, put in the comments. I want to expand my own reading as well, and it's a really interesting exercise to see what you really value out of literature. So as always, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I will be back soon with more books to add to my book list and hopefully to yours, and please add to mine in the comments, and I will talk to you soon.